Tourist touches the plume on the back of the king's guard head and gets a close shave. She had dreamed of this trip for years, the chance to explore the royal palaces, learn about the fascinating history of the country, and soak in the sights that people talked about in stories and movies. Emma had always been a curious traveler, the kind of person who wanted to see everything, touch everything, and learn as much as possible from every place she visited. As she walked down the narrow streets, the air was filled with the smell of freshly baked bread from nearby bakeries and the soft murmur of conversations in different languages. The city was alive with the buzz of tourists, each one eager to see the landmarks that made the place famous. But Emma was particularly excited about one thing: the royal palace, where the king and queen once lived, and where the royal guards still stood day after day in their full ceremonial uniforms. She had read about them online before her trip. The king's guard, a group of soldiers who stood guard outside the palace in full uniform, never breaking their stance. The hats they wore were tall and topped with big, bright plumes, feathers that swayed gently in the wind. She had seen photos of them online, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe when she saw them in person. They looked so serious, so disciplined, so different from the usual sight of soldiers she was used to seeing back home. Emma found herself drawn to them, almost as if they were a part of another time, another world. Emma had always been fascinated by history, especially royal history. As a child, she loved reading about kings, queens, and their grand palaces. She had studied the history of this city for months before her trip, and now, standing in front of the imposing palace gates, it felt surreal. She couldn't believe she was finally here. It felt like a dream. As she walked closer to the palace, Emma noticed the tourists gathered around the royal guards, snapping pictures, chatting quietly, and marveling at their composure. The guards stood perfectly still, their faces expressionless, their eyes fixed straight ahead. Not a single movement. Emma was impressed by how disciplined they were. She couldn't help but think about how uncomfortable it must be to stand so still for hours at a time, but the guards never flinched. They were like statues, and Emma found herself staring, wondering how they could manage it. She observed their uniforms carefully. The guards wore long, black coats, tall, shiny boots, and their hats were enormous, made of fur with a plume of bright red or white feathers sticking out from the top. It was clear that these plumes weren't just for decoration. They were a part of the soldiers' identity, marking them as members of the royal guard. Emma thought about how much effort must go into maintaining such a uniform, how the feathers must be carefully cleaned and shaped to look just right. She even noticed that the guards' boots gleamed in the sunlight, a testament to the attention to detail that went into every part of their outfit. As Emma stood there, a thought crossed her mind. She had seen so many tourists standing close to the guards, taking pictures and joking around. Some even waved their hands in front of their faces to see if the guards would blink. Emma, however, had a different idea. She wasn't interested in just taking pictures from afar. She wanted to understand these soldiers better, to see what made them so fascinating. She wanted to know what it felt like to be part of this centuries-old tradition, to understand the seriousness behind their role. She stepped a little closer, taking slow steps so as not to attract too much attention. She wasn't sure why, but something about the tall plume on the back of one guard's hat caught her attention. It was almost as if the feather was calling to her. It stood upright in the air, moving slightly with the breeze. Emma found herself wondering what it felt like to touch it. Was it soft? Was it as smooth as it looked? She had never seen such an unusual, elegant feather before. As Emma got closer, she noticed how beautiful the feather was up close, white with a hint of red at the tips. It was clearly well maintained, each strand of the plume perfectly in place. It seemed almost magical, like something out of a fairy tale. The more she looked at it, the more she was drawn to it. She wasn't thinking of anything bad or disrespectful. To her, It was simply a beautiful part of the guard's uniform, a piece of history that she could experience for herself. She glanced around, noticing that most of the tourists were busy taking pictures or chatting with each other. No one was paying too much attention to her. She took one more careful step forward. Her heart beat a little faster now. Was this allowed? Would the guard get upset? She wasn't sure, but the temptation was strong. She didn't think anyone would notice if she just touched it, just for a second. It wasn't like she was going to mess anything up. It was just a plume, after all. Emma hesitated for only a moment. Then, with a quick movement, she reached out her hand and gently touched the plume at the back of the guard's head. She felt the soft, feathery texture beneath her fingertips. It was even softer than she had imagined. For a split second, it felt as if the world around her had stopped. The sounds of the crowd faded away, and all she could focus on was the sensation of the plume. But the moment she touched it, something unexpected happened. The guard, who had been standing perfectly still, suddenly moved. His body stiffened, and without warning, he turned sharply around, his eyes narrowing as he looked directly at Emma. Her hand was still in the air, hovering near the plume, but she quickly retracted it, her face going pale with surprise. The tourists around her stopped talking and turned their attention to the scene. The atmosphere shifted from casual admiration to tense silence. Emma could feel her heart racing. Her breath caught in her throat as the guard's piercing gaze fixed on her. She wasn't sure what to do. Was she in trouble? Was she going to be thrown out of the palace grounds? A million thoughts rushed through her mind, but none of them made sense. All she knew was that the situation had escalated quickly, and she had no idea what to expect next. Emma's hand still hung in the air, her fingers trembling slightly as she stared at the guard who had just turned around. For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. The crowd around her became silent, as if they were all holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Emma's eyes locked with the guard's, and she could feel a sharp chill run down her spine. She hadn't meant to cause trouble, she had simply been curious about the plume. But now, standing face to face with the guard, she realized that her curiosity had led her into something much more serious. The guard's expression remained stern, his face completely unreadable. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. It was almost as if he had been waiting for this moment. Emma's heart was racing in her chest. What was going to happen now? She had seen enough movies and heard enough stories to know that royal guards were known for their strict code of conduct. Touching their uniform, or in this case, their plume, was probably a major violation. She hadn't meant to disrespect anyone. She had only wanted to understand the tradition better, to feel closer to the history of it all. But now, standing there, she realized how wrong she had been. The silence around her grew heavier. The tourists who had been happily snapping pictures a moment ago were now watching, their eyes wide with anticipation. Emma could hear the low murmur of whispers spreading through the crowd. Some people were looking at her with a mix of curiosity and judgment, while others seemed to be waiting for the guard to react. The air felt thick, and Emma's palms were beginning to sweat. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had done something terribly wrong. For a moment, the guard didn't speak. He simply stood there, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. It was almost as if he were sizing her up, weighing whether or not to take further action. Emma could feel the pressure of his gaze, like he was peering into her very soul, assessing her intentions. She swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how foolish she must look. She had touched the plume without thinking, and now she had no idea how to make it right. In the midst of the tense silence, Emma tried to find the words to apologize. Her mouth felt dry, and she could barely form a coherent thought. She had always been a confident traveler, quick with a smile and a friendly word, but now, with the royal guard standing so close, she felt like a child caught doing something wrong. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Her voice was stuck, lodged somewhere in her throat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the guard's lips parted. His voice was deep, cold, and commanding as he spoke. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked, his words sharp like the edge of a sword. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She nodded quickly, her face burning with embarrassment. I didn't mean to, I'm so sorry," she stammered. "I was just curious about the plume. I didn't know it was such a big deal." The guard's expression didn't soften. "You've touched something that is not for you to touch. This plume is part of a tradition that goes back centuries. It represents honor and duty, things that cannot be taken lightly." His voice didn't rise, but the authority in it was undeniable. It was a tone that brooked no argument. Emma's face turned even redder. She had heard stories of the royal guard's discipline, but she hadn't fully understood it until now. To her, it had all seemed like a fun tradition, a picture-perfect moment for tourists. But this guard's words made her realize that there was a much deeper meaning behind everything. The plume wasn't just a decoration or an accessory, it was a symbol. A symbol of centuries of service, of sacrifice, and of the duty these men had to protect the monarchy and the country itself. "I didn't know," Emma repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. She was starting to feel the weight of her mistake. "I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to disrespect the tradition. I just wanted to see it up close." The guard stared at her for a long moment, his eyes scanning her face. Emma had no idea what he was thinking, but she could feel the tension between them. She felt like a small, insignificant thing under the weight of his gaze. For a moment, she wondered if he would scold her or maybe even ask her to leave. Her stomach twisted at the thought. The last thing she wanted was to be embarrassed in front of all these people. And then, without warning, the guard stepped back slightly, his posture still rigid but less threatening. He didn't speak for a few moments, but Emma could see that he was thinking, weighing the situation. Emma held her breath, waiting for him to make the next move. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew she had to remain calm. If she panicked now, things would only get worse. Finally, the guard spoke again, his voice quieter this time, though still firm. "You are lucky that you did not cause any damage," he said. "Many tourists come here and they think it is a game, but this is not a game." He paused for a moment, as if allowing his words to sink in. "You must understand the seriousness of this moment. The guards do not stand here for entertainment. They are here to protect something far greater than any of us." Emma nodded quickly, eager to show that she understood. She had always respected history, but she hadn't realized how deeply the traditions could run. Now that she had been confronted with it directly, she could see just how serious it all was. She was not just a tourist in a foreign land anymore. She was part of something much bigger, something that demanded respect. "I understand," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "I promise I won't touch anything again. I didn't mean to disrespect you or your tradition." The guard looked at her for a moment longer, his gaze unyielding. Emma couldn't read his expression, but it seemed to soften just a little. He nodded once sharply, before turning his attention back to the crowd of tourists. Without another word, he resumed his position, standing still and unwavering as if nothing had happened at all. Emma took a step back, her heart still pounding in her chest. The tension in the air seemed to lift just slightly, but the weight of what had just occurred still hung over her. She glanced around at the other tourists, some of whom had watched the exchange with wide eyes. Others were busy taking photos again, their attention already shifting away from the moment. Emma's face was still flushed with embarrassment, and she felt a mixture of relief and humiliation. She knew she had learned an important lesson today, one she wouldn't soon forget. What had seemed like a harmless curiosity had nearly turned into a serious mistake. She took a deep breath, silently promising herself that she would be more careful in the future. As she turned to leave, her eyes caught the guard once more, standing tall and proud, a symbol of the tradition and discipline that she now respected more than ever before. Emma's heart still raced as she took a few steps back, her eyes still locked on the royal guard. Her hand felt strangely empty after touching the plume, as though a piece of the moment had been taken from her. She was still processing everything that had happened. The way the guard had turned around so sharply, the coldness in his voice, the weight of the situation, it all felt unreal. It wasn't just that she had made a mistake. It was that she had unknowingly crossed an invisible line, a line she hadn't even known existed until now. The sound of the crowd around her seemed to return, but everything felt muffled. Her ears buzzed with nervous energy, and she couldn't help but notice how some of the other tourists had turned to watch her. Some were still holding up their phones, capturing the moment for their own reasons. Others whispered to each other, their eyes flicking between her and the royal guard. Emma felt as though every single person around her was suddenly aware of her mistake. She had become the center of attention, and it wasn't a place she wanted to be. She forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to calm the rapid beat of her heart. There was a knot in her stomach now, a mixture of guilt and embarrassment that wouldn't let go. The moment had passed, but the tension in the air had not. She could still feel the weight of the guard's gaze, still hear his voice in her mind. "You've touched something that is not for you to touch." What was going to happen now? Would they ask her to leave? Would they call security? Emma glanced around quickly, hoping for some kind of sign, some clue about what she was supposed to do next. But the tourists around her were still absorbed in their own worlds, taking pictures and chatting amongst themselves. It seemed as though they had already moved on, forgetting about the brief confrontation, but Emma couldn't forget. Not yet. The guard, though still standing motionless, seemed to have relaxed slightly, though his posture was still as stiff and proud as before. Emma wasn't sure if this was a sign that he had forgiven her or if he was simply waiting for her to make the next move. The tension in the air was thick, and she had no idea how to break it. She felt foolish. She didn't even know what to say to him. She wanted to apologize again, but the words felt stuck in her throat. Suddenly, the guard made a slight movement, just a shift in his stance, a subtle glance in her direction. Emma was so focused on him that she almost didn't see the other guard step forward, his boots clicking sharply on the cobblestones as he moved to stand next to the one Emma had touched. This second guard was just as tall, just as serious, his uniform equally as immaculate. He looked down at Emma, his eyes scanning her for a moment, and then he spoke in a calm but authoritative voice. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked, his tone not unkind but firm. Emma opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. She swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes. I touched the plume. I didn't mean to. I didn't know it was such an important part of your uniform. I'm really sorry." She felt like a broken record, repeating herself, but she didn't know how else to explain it. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, and she couldn't make herself look directly at either of the guards for too long. The second guard didn't immediately respond. Instead, he glanced at the first guard, the one whose plume she had touched. The two exchanged a brief look, a silent communication between them that Emma couldn't interpret. It made her feel even more out of place. The feeling of being out of her depth grew stronger, like she had wandered into a world she didn't understand, where the rules were different and the consequences were unknown. After a moment, the first guard finally spoke again, his voice slightly softer, though still holding that commanding tone. "You are lucky that the tradition here is one of respect. Many visitors come here thinking it's a game, something they can casually interact with. They do not understand the responsibility we carry, but your apology and your understanding of the mistake you made, that is something we value." Emma felt a slight relief wash over her. At least he wasn't going to escalate things any further. He wasn't going to shout at her or call for security. He was, in his own way, acknowledging that she had made a mistake, but also showing that he appreciated her sincere apology. She felt like she was walking on thin ice, but at least she wasn't about to fall through. Yet. The second guard, who had remained quiet up until now, stepped forward a little closer. "This plume is not just decoration," he continued. "It's a symbol of our duty, our service. And for many, it represents the values of this country, honor, loyalty, and the respect we give to the monarchy. We do not take it lightly when someone disrespects that symbol." Emma nodded again, this time more confidently. "I understand," she said. "I didn't mean to disrespect anyone. I really didn't know how serious it was. I thought it was just a part of the uniform, not something so important." The first guard seemed to relax just a little more. "That is the problem with tourists. They come to see the spectacle, but they forget the meaning behind it. We stand here not just for show. We are protecting something much greater than ourselves." Emma, though still feeling nervous, couldn't help but admire the way the guards carried themselves. They weren't just standing there because it was their job. They were standing there because they believed in something bigger than themselves. She had always admired history, but now she was beginning to understand it in a way she never had before. The guards weren't just part of a show for tourists to take pictures with. They were the living embodiment of centuries of tradition. The second guard's expression softened slightly, though he didn't smile. "You are fortunate that you didn't cause any harm to the uniform," he said. "We are not angry with you, but we do want you to learn from this. Please remember this lesson next time. Respect the tradition." Emma felt a deep sense of relief, but also a deep sense of gratitude. "I will," she promised, her voice steady now. "I won't forget." The guards nodded once more, and without another word, they turned their attention back to the palace gate, resuming their positions. The moment of tension had passed, but Emma stood there for a few more seconds, letting the significance of the conversation sink in. As she turned to leave, Emma glanced back at the guards one last time. They were standing tall, unmoving, as if nothing had happened at all. But Emma knew that something had changed for her. She had learned a lesson in respect, in history, and in the deep traditions that many people held sacred. She felt a little foolish for her initial curiosity, but now she understood the seriousness of the situation. She would never look at the royal guards in quite the same way again. As she walked away, Emma promised herself that next time, she would approach history with more awareness and more respect. The royal guards had taught her something valuable today, not just about their tradition, but about how important it was to understand the world around her, to learn about it deeply before acting. And that lesson, she knew, would stay with her forever. Emma stood there for a moment, her heart still racing in her chest. The cool breeze of the afternoon air brushed against her face, but it did little to calm her nerves. She had just been lectured by two of the royal guards, but what struck her most was the way they had spoken to her, not angrily or with harsh words, but with calm, serious authority. They weren't upset. They were making sure she understood. And as the weight of their words sank deeper into her mind, Emma felt an overwhelming mix of guilt and awe. She hadn't expected it to feel this way. What had started as a simple act of curiosity, touching the plume on the back of the guard's head, had suddenly turned into something much more significant. She hadn't realized before just how deep the traditions ran or how much the guards themselves respected their role. They weren't just standing there for show. They were upholding something far greater than themselves, centuries of history, tradition, and an unbroken chain of duty. As Emma took another step back, she could feel the eyes of the other tourists on her. She glanced around, noticing that some people were still looking at her with a mix of curiosity and judgment. A few tourists whispered to each other, their eyes flicking between her and the guards. Emma tried to ignore them, but it was hard to shake the feeling that everyone was watching her. It wasn't just her mistake anymore. It had become a moment for others to witness, to judge, and to make their own assumptions about what had happened. But what hurt the most wasn't the attention of the other tourists. It was the realization of how much she had underestimated the significance of the Royal Guard's uniform, their position, and the plume itself. She had been so focused on the outward appearance of things, the shiny boots, the tall hats, the swaying plumes, that she had never bothered to understand what those symbols actually meant. The guards had made it clear now that these weren't just costumes or props for tourists. They were part of a living tradition, a tradition built on honor, service, and an unwavering commitment to the country they served. Emma looked back at the guards, her gaze lingering on their still forms. Their faces were as stoic as ever, their eyes fixed forward, as though they had already forgotten the brief exchange between them and the young tourist. They were back to their positions, standing straight and tall as if nothing had happened. But Emma knew something had changed. She had learned something she hadn't expected, and it wasn't just about the plume. It was about respect. She felt a deep sense of shame now, but not in the way she had expected. It wasn't because she had been caught doing something wrong. It was because she had realized in that moment how much she had taken for granted. She had assumed that the guards were simply there for her entertainment, a part of the tourist experience she could snap pictures of and admire from a distance. But in that moment, as she stood there in front of them, Emma realized how little she truly knew. She had been ignorant of the deeper meanings behind what she had seen. And now, because of her careless mistake, she had a new understanding of the seriousness of it all. The more she thought about it, the more she understood why the guard had reacted the way he did. It wasn't just about the plume. It was about preserving the dignity of their position, the tradition they were upholding. Every part of their uniform, from the tall hats to the shining boots, had meaning. Every movement, every posture, was an expression of the duty they had taken on. And she, by touching something as sacred as the plume, had unknowingly disrupted that duty. It wasn't something she had meant to do, but the reality was that she had, and it hurt her more than she had expected. As Emma walked a few steps away from the palace gates, her eyes still fixed on the guards in the distance, she couldn't help but reflect on how her own understanding of the world had just shifted. She had always been curious, always the kind of person who asked questions and sought out new experiences. But curiosity, she was beginning to understand, could also be a double-edged sword. It could lead to new discoveries and growth, but it could also bring unintended consequences. Her mind drifted back to her earlier thoughts, how she had seen the guards as statues, as living representations of history, but only in the most superficial way. She had admired their uniforms, their statuesque postures, and the way they stood at attention without a hint of emotion. But now she saw them differently. She saw the pride in their eyes, the responsibility in their shoulders, and the weight of tradition in every movement. They weren't just symbols of the past, they were a part of the present. They were living embodiments of the history that had shaped this country, and Emma had just learned, in the hardest way possible, that the past was never something to take lightly. As she walked farther down the cobblestone path, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something important about herself, too. Before today, Emma had always prided herself on her knowledge of history. She had read countless books, watched documentaries, and studied the customs of the places she visited. But in this moment, she realized that real understanding came not from reading about something in books, but from living it, truly experiencing it. She had never really understood what it meant to respect history until she had stood in front of those royal guards, seen the tradition in their eyes, and felt the weight of their duty. Emma took another deep breath, trying to steady herself. She wasn't sure what would happen next. She didn't know if anyone would remember her mistake or if the guards would ever think about it again. But she knew that she would never forget this moment. It had changed her in a way she hadn't expected, and though the embarrassment was still there, it had also opened her eyes to something bigger. As she continued walking, Emma decided that she needed to be more mindful in the future, not just as a tourist, but as a person moving through the world. She had always been someone who wanted to experience everything, who wanted to get as close as possible to the people and places she admired. But now, she understood that getting close didn't always mean touching or interacting. Sometimes it meant simply observing, respecting, and appreciating from a distance. She smiled to herself, the weight of the situation finally starting to lift. Maybe this wasn't the perfect day of sightseeing she had imagined, but it had been a day of learning, a day of growth. And that, she realized, was what travel was truly about. Not just seeing the world, but understanding it in a way that made her better, made her more aware, and made her respect the traditions that shaped it. With each step she took away from the palace, Emma felt a little lighter. The lesson had been hard to learn, but she was grateful for it. In the end, she knew that it wasn't the mistake that mattered. It was how she learned from it, how she grew, and how she would carry that understanding with her for the rest of her journey. As Emma walked farther away from the royal guards, she found herself feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. The weight of her mistake still clung to her, but it wasn't the crushing embarrassment that had threatened to overwhelm her earlier. Instead, it was a quiet sense of respect and understanding that had begun to settle within her. She had learned something important today, not just about royal traditions, but about herself. She glanced back once more toward the palace gates. The guards were standing as they had before, tall and unmoving. To anyone who hadn't seen what had happened, they would look like nothing more than statues, silent sentinels, guarding the entrance to the monarchy. But Emma now understood that they were so much more than that. They weren't there just for the tourists, for pictures or admiration. They were there as symbols of something far deeper. She had touched something sacred without knowing it, and it had shaken her in a way that nothing else ever had. Though the moment had passed, Emma couldn't help but replay it in her mind. The way the guards had reacted, so calm but firm. The way they had explained the history and tradition behind their duty, as though they were passing on a lesson to her, not out of anger, but out of a desire to make her understand. They had given her a chance to reflect, to see the world differently, and she was grateful for that. The lesson wasn't just about the plume or the uniform. It was about the importance of understanding and respecting the things that shape the world around you, even when you don't fully understand them at first. For a moment, Emma felt almost like an outsider. She had come to this beautiful city expecting to simply be a tourist, to enjoy the sights and take in the history, but she hadn't expected to feel so connected to it. She had thought she was merely observing history, but now she realized that history was observing her. Every small action, every choice she made carried weight. It wasn't just about admiring the past, it was about respecting it, learning from it, and carrying its lessons forward. As she continued down the street, she felt a shift in her perspective. She had always prided herself on being an open-minded and curious traveler. She loved discovering new places, meeting new people, and learning about cultures different from her own. But what had happened here today reminded her that true understanding didn't come from simply being close to something. It came from truly listening, truly seeing, and truly respecting. It wasn't enough to simply stand in front of something and admire its beauty or history. Sometimes you had to dig deeper to ask questions, to learn the reasons behind the traditions, to understand the meaning behind the symbols. Emma's steps grew more confident as she walked away from the palace, but her thoughts remained with the royal guards. She could still see them in her mind's eye, perfectly still, their postures straight and proud. They were a living connection to the past, a reminder of the sacrifices made, the lessons learned, and the responsibility carried forward. They weren't just soldiers, they were keepers of history. And in that moment, Emma realized that by learning from them, she had also become a keeper of history in her own way. She would carry the lesson they had taught her, the importance of respect, of tradition, and of understanding, back with her into the world. As she walked through the city, Emma noticed the little things more. The way the sun glinted off the old buildings, the quiet murmur of people chatting in cafes, the soft rustle of leaves in the trees. She began to appreciate the city in a new light, not just as a place to visit, but as a living, breathing part of the world's history. She felt a deeper connection to the place now. It wasn't just a destination, it was a story in itself, full of meaning, full of tradition. And she was a small part of it, a visitor who had learned something valuable in the short time she had spent there. Later that evening, when Emma sat down to have dinner at a small cafe near the city square, she couldn't help but think back to the events of the day. She had been embarrassed, yes, but that wasn't all she felt. She also felt a sense of gratitude for the guards and the lesson they had imparted. She had learned so much more than she ever expected. It wasn't just about respecting the Royal Guard's uniform, but about respecting the people and traditions that made up the fabric of the country. It was about understanding that every tradition, every symbol, held a story, a purpose. As she sipped her coffee, Emma smiled to herself. She had made a mistake, but it had turned into something more, a personal growth, a shift in how she viewed the world around her. The embarrassment that had felt so overwhelming earlier now seemed like a small part of something much bigger. It had been a mistake, yes, but it had been a lesson too, and she wasn't going to let that lesson go to waste. Tomorrow, Emma would go back to the palace, take another walk through the gardens, and maybe even visit the royal guards again, this time with a new understanding. She would be more mindful, more aware of the traditions that had been carefully preserved for centuries. And she would carry that awareness with her for the rest of her travels. She would remember the lesson of the plume, and how a simple touch had led her to see the world in a new light. The world wasn't just about what was in front of her, it was about what lay beneath the surface. It was about understanding the history, the meaning, and the stories that had shaped everything she saw. She knew now that true respect wasn't just about admiring things from a distance. It was about taking the time to understand, to learn, and to appreciate the deeper significance of everything. With that thought in mind, Emma finished her meal, paid for her coffee, and stood up from the table. As she walked out into the night, the soft glow of the street lamps illuminating the path ahead, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't just a tourist anymore. She was someone who had learned something meaningful, and that was worth far more than any souvenir or photograph she could take home. Emma's journey was just beginning, but now she felt ready to experience it with a deeper sense of understanding and a greater respect for the world around her. Whatever she would encounter next, she knew it would be an experience worth remembering, not just for the sights she would see, but for the lessons she would learn along the way.